Before Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth, before Alan Shepard saw the curvature of the planet from his Mercury capsule, before any human being had ever been confirmed safely returned from space. Dozens of small mongrel dogs plucked from the streets of Moscow were strapped into rockets and sent up to find out whether a living mammal could survive what nobody yet knew about space. Some came home. Some did not. All of them were the reason humans ever got to go. In the early 1,950 seconds, the Soviet Institute of Aviation Medicine was given a mission: find out biologically whether life could survive the launch profile of an R-1 ballistic missile. The Americans chose chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys for similar work. The Soviets chose dogs, specifically female stray mongrels picked off the streets of Moscow. The choice was deliberate. Strays were selected because in the harsh winters of Moscow, the dogs that survived on the streets were the hardiest. They had immune systems that had already battled extreme cold, hunger, and stress. Females were selected because the engineers found it simpler to design a sanitation system for a dog that squatted to urinate rather than lifted a leg. Small dogs were preferred because the capsules were tiny. The ideal candidate was under 6 kilograms, between 2 and 6 years old, light-colored so they would photograph well on grainy 1,950 seconds film, and emotionally placid under stress. Training was systematic and grueling. The dogs spent weeks at a time inside increasingly tight enclosures, conditioning them to tolerate confinement. They were placed in centrifuges that subjected them to launch-equivalent acceleration. They were spun. They were vibrated. They were dressed in fitted pressure suits with helmets clamped over their snouts. They were fed a nutrient gel through tubes. They wore sanitation harnesses with collection bags. Some sessions lasted up to 20 days in a fully sealed capsule. Researchers tracked their heart rates, respiration, blood pressure, and stress hormones across every stage. The dogs who tolerated the procedures with the lowest physiological stress response became the flight candidates. The others were rotated to control studies or returned to staff homes. Many of the trainers grew deeply attached. The dogs lived in researchers' apartments between sessions, slept on couches, were named, were fed, were petted, were loved. This was not a cold, faceless program. The scientists knew exactly what they were doing, and they cared. On the 22nd of July, 1951, 2 dogs named Dzik and Saigon rode an R-1 rocket to an altitude of about 110 kilometers, just above the Kármán line, the formal boundary of space. They came back down by parachute. They survived. They were the first higher mammals to leave the atmosphere and return. 6 years before Sputnik, 10 years before Gagarin. Dzik flew again a week later. He died on that second flight when the parachute failed. After his death, his original flight partner, Saigon, was retired immediately by order of one of the senior scientists, who took the dog home as a pet for the rest of his life. Across the program, 15 suborbital missions were flown between 1951 and 1956. Of the 36 dog flights, about a third resulted in fatalities, mostly due to parachute or pressure system failures. The survivors flew again. Some flew 5 times. On the 3rd of November 1957, just 1 month after Sputnik 1 had shocked the world, Sputnik 2 launched. On board was a 3-year-old mixed-breed female, a former Moscow stray, weighing about 6 kilograms. Her official name was Laika, which translates roughly as Barker. Her trainers called her Kudryavka, Little Curly. She was the first living creature to enter orbit around the Earth. Sputnik 2 had been built and prepared in less than 4 weeks, on Khrushchev's order to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. There was no time to design a re-entry system. Laika was never coming back. The official Soviet story for decades was that she had survived several days in orbit and then been peacefully euthanized when her oxygen ran low. That was not true. The full story did not emerge until 2002, when one of the lead scientists, Dmitry Malyshenkov, published the actual telemetry. A thermal control malfunction caused the cabin temperature to rise rapidly after the 3rd orbit. Laika died of heat stress and panic within 5 to 7 hours of launch. One of her trainers later admitted to a journalist that they had taken her home in the days before the launch, played with her, knowing she would not return. In 2008, Russia unveiled a small monument to her near the military research facility where she had been trained. It depicts her standing alone on top of a rocket. Her sacrifice is what gave the program the data to design the first survivable orbital capsule. On the 19th of August, 1960, Sputnik 5 launched 2 dogs named Belka and Strelka into orbit, along with a small ark of other passengers, 40 mice, 2 rats, a rabbit, fruit flies, plants, and fungal samples. They orbited the Earth 17 times over the course of a day, and then, for the first time ever, they came home alive. Belka and Strelka became global celebrities. They appeared on Soviet television. Cosmonauts, including Gagarin, met them in person. Strelka later had a litter of 6 puppies. One of them, named Pushinka, which translates as Fluffy, was given as a diplomatic gift by Khrushchev to John F. Kennedy in 1961 at the height of the Cold War. Pushinka lived in the White House with the Kennedys and eventually had her own litter with one of Caroline Kennedy's dogs. JFK called those puppies the Pupniks. There are descendants of Strelka, the Soviet space dog, alive in American pet homes today. By the time Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth on the 12th of April, 1961, becoming the first human in space, he was sitting in a capsule whose life support, parachute, ejection system, suit pressurization, food delivery, and survival profile had been refined across more than 50 dog flights. Gagarin himself acknowledged in interviews that he was sometimes unsure whether he was a cosmonaut or just another dog with a different name. Across the entire Soviet dog program from 1951 to 1966, approximately 57 dogs flew. The exact count is debated because the Soviets did not always publicize losses, and several flights involved repeat passengers. The biological data they generated on radiation exposure, blood gas changes during launch, vestibular response to microgravity, post-flight orthostatic intolerance, still informs modern human spaceflight medicine. Without those dogs, every human spaceflight program in history would have started behind where it actually started. Most of the surviving space dogs were quietly adopted by the scientists who had trained them. They lived out long retirements in apartments around Moscow. Strelka lived to be 14, Belka lived to be 12, Vedorocek and Ugaliak, who in 1966 set the longest dog spaceflight record at 22 days in orbit, a duration record that still stood when human astronauts began making longer missions years later. Both came home alive and were retired to research kennels where they lived out their natural lives in dignity. One particularly famous escape: in 1960, a dog named Bars and her partner Laika were supposed to fly an early orbital test. The rocket exploded 28 seconds into flight, killing both dogs. A backup dog named Krasivka was scheduled for the very next flight. 3 months later, that capsule launched but failed to reach orbit and crashed back to Earth in a remote area of Siberia. When recovery crews finally located the capsule days later in the deep snow, Krasivka was found alive inside, calmly waiting. The lead engineer, Oleg Yasenko, adopted her immediately. She lived with his family for 14 more years. The space dogs were not heroes by choice. They did not volunteer. They could not consent. But they were, by every measure their trainers could record, loved. The men and women who put them into those rockets did not see them as test subjects. They saw them as colleagues. When Laika died in orbit, one of her trainers reportedly never went into her laboratory office again. Every human astronaut who has ever flown owes a debt to a dog. Not metaphorically, literally. The biological systems engineering, the survival protocols, the suit pressures, the food gels, the parachute timing, the cabin atmospheres, all of it was developed on small, calm, mixed-breed mongrels who used to scavenge dumpsters in Moscow. The first mammal to circle the Earth was a stray named Laika. We should not forget that some of them came home, some of them did not. All of them looked up, and we followed them